Episode 254, When We Lose Diversity. This is the Change Underground for the 26th of April 2021. I'm your host, John Moore. Decarbonise the air, recarbonise the soil. We have lived through a period of agriculture that could be best described as over-specialisation. The number of mixed farms dropped after the Second World War. From being cereal farmers, say growing maize, wheat, oats, rye, clover, peas and barley, individuals were driven by government incentives and market forces into growing one or two crops, maize and soybeans. The idea of a mixed farm, cropping pastures, animals and maybe some timber or fruit orchard, was derided as inefficient. One product, specialisation and expertise in that crop would lead to bigger and better yields. Now, from what I've read over the years, the bigger and better yields were never actually linked directly to higher incomes, but that meaning seems implicit. What happened across great swathes of the industrialised world was a huge run-up in the volume of commodities. Wheat, maize, rice, sugar, cotton and other grains too were affected by these changes. Let's have a look at a situation prior to the push for specialisation. Now by specialisation I'm talking about industrialised levels in specialisation, not hill farmers whose land is only suitable for sheep, nor those graziers in high levels of predation, where cattle alone make the most sense. I'm talking about those farms that sat in the middle ground, maybe a few dairy cows for the house supply and to feed some pigs, or a larger cattle operation as part of their systems, sheep to follow the bovines, rotated paddocks with wheat, field peas and barley, and then pasture for a few years. At the very least a home orchard and a veggie patch, some grain storage on site, or again the use of pigs to convert surpluses into a saleable product, while generating manures in the process. The income streams for this sort of operation varied, as were the tasks throughout the year. So sale of milk or cattle, pigs, lambs, wool, wheat, barley and peas would cover each other in some ways in most years. Say wool prices are down, then wheat and pork are up and vice versa. As the vagaries of the markets play out, the point is, this sort of farm is not tied to one particular market. The other obvious point is the interconnectedness of the enterprise. Stock manuring land in preparation for cereals, cereal stubble feeding sheep, screened cereal grains used for sowing next year's crop, smaller ones being fed to pigs, which of course produce both pork and manures. With a mixed system like this and a moderately capable farmer, the soil could do nothing but improve. Enter the efficiency gods. Fences ripped out, hedges torn down, tractors upsized and maize planted from boundary to boundary. A heavy feed of maize would drain a soil produced by a mixed farm in a few years. But that didn't matter. These maize varieties were bred for use with artificial, scientifically formulated fertilisers. Now, I have nothing per se against science. Indeed, I'm trying to see the world as it is. Indeed, I'm trying to see the world as I see it as nothing but a series of hypotheses I have assumed to be correct. Okay, so some things like the theories of gravity and evolution I'm happy to accept as proven. But what if everything I assumed was correct didn't match the empirical data and I hadn't noticed because I assumed I knew the answers already? So no, I have nothing against the scientific method, but I have a lot against the advertising use of science. Science funded by vested interests is another way of putting it. Imagine the situation. An ag chem company develops a fertiliser. They run some trials, both with and without the new Wonder product. And yes, the ones that used the Wonder product were far more productive. Woohoo! Straight to sales. Did the trials measure runoff of this particular fertiliser, its effects on water quality, its effects on soil biota, on inhalation by the farmer of aerosolised particles, or if the new product interacted unfavourably with residual compounds from other chemical producers, or if the production system promoted protected the soil from wind or water erosion? In 99.9% of cases, of course not. The trials were set up to sell the product. Then comes the wonders of increased productivity. Now, I don't mean to be cynical, it just happens some days. So great, extra productivity per land unit area. So tonnes per hectare, bushels per Fahrenheit or whatever. At first glance, this might seem a good thing. Yet if you look over the boundary fence, you'll see that everyone else has increased productivity. And guess what? We're all selling the same thing into the same market. There's this thing called demand and supply. If the supply of a good increases, the prices should drop to clear the market. That's the theory. May not hold true for all things, but for commodities, it's almost set in stone. Many sellers, many buyers, close to perfect knowledge of the market on both sides, results in prices falling when supply increases and demand remains static. So what happens on our theoretical farm? From using a mixture of animals and plants to support soil fertility and being buffered from changes in one market by having other markets to support the enterprise, this farm is now buying an artificial fertiliser, seed and maybe even water. Then selling into an increasingly supplied single marketplace where the producer is a price taker, not a price maker. Over time, this monocultural production system attracts pests and disease to itself, as it's basically a huge food source without any biological protection from other species, because there aren't any. And so costs increase as pesticides and herbicides are added to this method of farming. As costs increase to produce even more, prices fall. The advice from agri-economists then is to get big or get out so that you can have smaller profit margins, but if you've got lots more land, you still make a lot of money. So how does one get big? Well, buy more land. And this takes some people out of your local rural economies and cultures and sends them off to the urban suburban world. Now, with all this extra land to look after, we're going to need bigger machinery to work it. Some enterprises can do all this without debt, but many cannot. And as the size of the farms has increased in the industrialised world, so too has the debt level. I believe it was Gabe Brown that I talked about some episodes back now, link in the show notes, who mentioned on a cover crop podcast that his neighbours were basically planting $800,000 in spring in the hope of harvesting $850,000 in late summer. He also said that that was no way to sleep well at night. In such a precarious position, even with the subsidies and crop insurances and so on available to, say, US farmers, even they are going out of business and destroying soils in the hope of a return. I don't condemn them, they were following what looked like the best advice they could get. And in places without the same levels of subsidy, the situation is worse. Toss in a little global warming with floods, fires and droughts, sometimes in the 1 year, and any enterprise that puts all its eggs into one basket, so to speak, is going to be in trouble. Back in episode 246, link in the show notes, I reported on a third of the US Corn Belt being without topsoil. And this is the obvious end point of the specialization path this episode today has discussed. What's to be done? Well, bringing back animals to cereal enterprises in a regenerative way would be a good start. Mob grazing and all the other things we've discussed here over the past 5 and a bit years, then soils would be rebuilt. I think we tamper as a species with things that have been proven themselves in the long run. Usually for increased returns, but also because efficiency, whatever that truly means. Let's remember that cereals are just grasses that have been subjected to selection pressures over time. They co-evolved with herbivores in a symbiotic relationship, hence the great productivity of places like the Serengeti, the Pampas, the steppe and the prairies. Plants, mostly grasses, but other things as well, feeding and being fed by herbivores. If we can remove the debt impost, we can rejuvenate these landscapes. We can do so in a way that's carbon negative, decarbonising the soils. Where have I heard that before? The tools are at hand. The current system, which craves increasing productivity on a finite landmass and finances productivity increases through debt, is not sustainable, humane, nor uplifting. We must ensure agriculture is part of the COP26 outcome in Glasgow this November, COVID permitting. We can also ensure our gardens include animals, even if it's only a couple of guinea pigs in a movable hutch spreading their droppings through time and space. We can find a way to blend the vegetative and the animal. A reminder that we're also trying to improve the lot of people in Uganda through support of the Bubugo Conservation Trust, with 10% of course sales and the Buy Me a Coffee link on the World Organic News page being donated to the Bubugo Conservation Trust for use in their sustainable farming system program. Now, if you have any questions, thoughts or suggestions about the podcast, I've opened a new Facebook group that I've called imaginatively the Change Underground Podcast Group. You can search that on Facebook, or there's a link in the show notes and in the transcript over at worldorganicnews.com/episode 254. So put some thought into it. See if you can work animals into your garden or your backyard or your small holding in some way. Now, most small holdings have animals at their centre anyway, so it's probably already happening. But have a look around what's going on around you and see if you can see the things I've been talking about. And remember that the best way to save the planet and everything on it, including us, at the moment is to decarbonise the air and recarbonise the soil. Thanks for listening, and I'll be back next week.